A pale sun sank behind the red horizon, painting the desert in soft gold. When she first saw it, the ranch her grandfather had once called home. It stood alone in the great emptiness, like a memory refusing to fade. Its roof bowed, and its porch half broken, but still standing proud against the wind. The stagecoach had left her miles back, and now her boots pressed into dry earth as the silence of the land settled around her. The desert had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the whisper of dust and the faint creak of her suitcase handle. She had imagined this place 100 times growing up, but the real thing, that lonely cabin at the edge of the world, felt heavier, sadder, like it carried secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. The letter had arrived. Written in his old-fashioned handwriting, the kind that made every word feel like a piece of history. It said she had inherited his ranch, the last piece of our blood's ground, as he put it. No one in the family had spoken of it for years. They said the land was cursed, too dry to grow a thing, too far from the nearest town to matter. Yet something in her heart had pushed her to come. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was longing. Or maybe she just wanted to stand where he once stood and feel what he had felt, that lonely pride of owning. Something carved out of the wild. By the time she reached the porch, the sky had turned a deep orange, and the air smelled of heat and dust. Her fingers brushed the wooden rail, worn smooth by time. She could almost imagine him sitting there in his rocking chair, watching the horizon for rain that never came. She unlocked the door, and it gave way with a sigh. Inside, the air was stale, but gentle, filled with the scent of old pine and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood long gone dry. She ran her hand across the table, tracing the marks where his tools must have laid. Everything was still in its place. A hat on the hook, a lantern on the shelf, a Bible by the bed. It was as if he had just stepped out for a walk and never returned. She set her suitcase down and sat. In the wooden chair by the window, outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the sound of something faint, a bell, maybe, or the ghostly echo of a horse bridle. The land stretched out in all directions, endless and empty. Somewhere far away, a coyote called, breaking the silence for a heartbeat. She felt small there, smaller than she ever had in the city. The world was too wide and the night too close. Yet in that moment, she also felt something else belonging. It was strange, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the desert was watching her, waiting for her to remember something it already knew. When morning came, she found the journal. It was tucked beneath the bed, bound in cracked leather, her grandfather's initials burned into the cover. The pages were filled with his tight, deliberate handwriting lines about the seasons, the cattle that never came back, the storms that tore through the roof. But deeper in, the tone changed. He began writing of strangers coming at night, of footprints in the sand that vanished by dawn, and of voices calling his name from the well. "It's not the land that's cursed," he wrote in one trembling line. "It's what's buried beneath it." She read that sentence twice, her heart thudding in her chest. Then she turned the page, only to find that the rest had been torn out. She stepped outside, clutching the journal. The morning sun burned bright, but the air still held a chill. The wind dragged trails through the sand, erasing her footprints as she walked toward the well he had written about. It stood a short way from the cabin, half covered in dust, its rope frayed and dry. She peered inside. Darkness stared back. Something about it felt wrong, too deep, too silent. She dropped a small stone in and waited for the sound of it hitting bottom. None came. The silence went on until she backed away, her throat tight. It was then she noticed something carved into the stones around the well, symbols she didn't recognize, but they looked old, older than the ranch itself. Back inside, she tried to shake it off. She made herself some tea on the small wood stove and opened the windows to let the light in. Dust floated in the air like snow. The walls creaked as if whispering to one another. On the mantel above the fireplace, she found a small framed photo of her grandfather standing with a woman she didn't recognize. Not her grandmother, but someone else. The woman's face was half faded, but her expression was hauntingly calm, her hand resting gently on his arm. On the back of the photograph, in faint pencil, were the words she came back. That was all. No date, no name. Just that phrase. She went outside again, unable to stay still. The desert stretched before her in its terrible beauty, shimmering in the noon heat. She walked farther this time, past the corral where the fences had fallen, past the old windmill that no longer turned. Every step stirred memories she didn't own. When the wind blew hard, she could almost hear voices, laughter, the clang of metal, the sound of horses. She told herself it was just her imagination, but a deep unease crawled through her chest. The land didn't feel dead. It felt like it was sleeping that night. She couldn't rest. The floorboards groaned as the house settled, and the wind whistled through the cracks like breath through teeth. Around midnight, she heard a sound from outside, slow, deliberate footsteps in the dirt. She froze, every nerve alive. The steps circled the cabin once, twice, and then stopped at the door. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. She waited, her heart pounding, but no one knocked. No one entered. When she finally found the courage to look out the window, the desert was empty again, as if nothing had moved at all. Yet in the morning, she found footprints leading from the door straight toward the well. For days, she tried to make sense of it. She told herself it could have been travelers, or her own imagination playing tricks in the loneliness. But every night brought something new, the faint scent of tobacco in the air. The sound of a chair rocking, though no one sat in it, the journal shifting on its own across the table. She wanted to leave, yet something in her refused. Maybe it was her grandfather's words about blood and land. Maybe she felt she owed it to him to understand. Or maybe the desert had already claimed her the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she stood outside watching the shadows stretch long across the ground. The air was still. Then, in the silence, she heard it again, a voice, low and sorrowful, calling her name from the direction of the well. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was soft but unmistakable, like someone she had once known but couldn't place. She took a step forward, then another. The light dimmed, the world narrowing around her. And as the wind began to rise, she realized something that made her heart twist. The voice wasn't calling for help. It was calling her home. The voice from the well lingered in her mind long after the wind had gone still. She didn't tell herself it wasn't real anymore. She just didn't know what to believe. That night, she sat on the porch with her grandfather's old lantern burning low beside her, its flame trembling with every breath of air. The desert stretched out under a thin moon. Somewhere far off a coyote called again, the same mournful tone she'd heard her first night there. She couldn't sleep, not when the night felt so alive. So she stayed there, rocking slowly in the chair that creaked beneath her weight, staring toward the dark line where the land met the stars the next morning. She started to explore the property more carefully. The ranch wasn't large, but it held pieces of a life that had once been full. There was a small barn out back, half collapsed, the smell of old hay and oil clinging to the air. She found rusted tools hanging on the walls, a saddle covered in dust, and a trunk in the corner that was locked tight. The floor was covered in sand that had blown in through the gaps in the wood. Under the dirt, she saw old tracks, boots, not bare feet. Whoever had been there last had been heavy, and not too long ago. She brushed her hands against the prints, feeling the faint grooves. Something in her said she wasn't alone on that land. By noon, she had worked up the courage to walk back toward the well. The sun blazed high, and the air shimmered with heat, but she felt cold inside. The windmill beside the well creaked lazily, its shadow falling long across the ground. She circled the stones again, tracing the strange markings she'd seen before. Up close, they seemed deliberate, carved deep, almost ritual-like. Some looked like letters, others like symbols from a time before hers. She knelt and touched one of them, and for a moment the air felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, faintly, she heard something, not a voice this time, but a slow, rhythmic sound from below, like something moving against the stone far beneath the surface. She stumbled back, her breath sharp. Maybe it was the wind, she told herself. Maybe the desert was playing tricks again. But a part of her, the part that had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories about this land, knew better. He used to say that the desert never forgets, that it remembers the people who walk on it, and sometimes it calls them back. Back in the cabin, she searched through every drawer and shelf for more of his writings. The missing pages from the journal haunted her. She found small pieces of paper hidden under the floorboards, torn notes with half-sentences written in pencil. "They come with the storm," one said. Another, barely legible, "Read, she watches from the well." She laid them out on the table, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of them. It wasn't just rambling. It felt like warnings. As the sun dipped low, she sat by the window again, staring at the photo she'd found earlier. The woman beside her grandfather seemed more vivid now in the fading light. There was something familiar about her, not in the face itself, but in the feeling it stirred. A quiet sorrow. On impulse, she turned the photo over again and noticed faint indentations under the words she came back, as if something had once been written there and later erased. She tilted it toward the light, and just barely she could make out a few ghosted letters. It looked like a name, but she couldn't read it. She decided to visit the small cemetery that lay behind the ranch, a place her grandfather had mentioned only once in his letters. It was just a patch of dry ground marked by crooked wooden crosses and stones. Most of the names had faded with the years, but one stood out, a stone marked with only initials and a single date. The date matched the year her grandmother had died, though the initials were different. Her heart skipped. She knelt beside it, brushing the dust away, and found something buried in the dirt beside the marker, a rusted locket. Inside was a small photograph of the same woman from the picture inside the house. Only this time, the woman was standing alone in front of the cabin, holding a child. That night, the wind came hard. It howled through the desert like a train, shaking the shutters and making the house moan. She sat by the fire with the journal open in her lap, the locket in her palm. Every few minutes, she thought she heard footsteps outside, but when she looked through the window, there was nothing. Just the dark, endless desert. The fire flickered and dimmed, and in the faint glow, she thought she saw a movement, a shadow across the far wall. Her chest tightened. She whispered her grandfather's name without meaning to, as if hoping he'd answer. Something inside her wanted to run, but another part wanted to know. She wasn't the kind of woman who scared easily. Life in the city had been loud and cold, filled with people who never looked her in the eye. Out here, at least, the fear was honest. You could feel it in your bones. You could name it. When morning came, the wind was gone. The world outside was quiet again, too quiet. She stepped out and found something new near the well, a set of footprints leading away from it, crossing the sand toward the hills. They were small, too small for a grown man. She followed them for a while until they disappeared into the hard ground, ending as suddenly as they began. The desert gave nothing back, not even a clue. That afternoon, she met someone. A rider appeared on the horizon, coming slow from the south. He was a tall man, weathered by the sun, his horse kicking up dust as he approached. When he stopped by the fence, he tipped his hat and greeted her with a voice that carried both kindness and caution. He said he used to know her grandfather, helped him fix the fences a few seasons before he passed. She asked if he knew anything about the land, about what had happened here, but he just looked toward the well and shook his head. Some places remember more than they should, he said, and some folks don't rest easy. He warned her to stay inside at night, especially when the wind blew from the east. Then he turned his horse and rode off without another word. His visit only deepened the questions. That evening, she searched through her grandfather's old letters again, and one caught her eye. A piece of paper tucked behind the lining of a drawer. It was a letter never sent, addressed to her. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There are things you should know about this place, about our family. Not all blood carries peace. Some debts go back further than memory. She stopped there, her throat tight. The bottom half of the letter had been torn away. That night she dreamed of water. She saw the well overflowing, dark and cold, the windmill turning wildly above it. She saw a woman standing beside it, her face hidden by her hair, whispering words she couldn't understand. When she woke, the sheets were damp with sweat, and outside, the windmill really was turning. The sound of it creaking echoed across the land like a heartbeat. She stepped out into the morning light, the sky pale and cloudless. Her eyes went straight to the well. Something glimmered there at the edge, a piece of fabric caught on the stone. She walked closer and pulled it free. It was a scrap of faded cloth, old and brittle, patterned with small blue flowers. The same pattern as the dress the woman had worn in the photograph. The air grew still. She felt the weight of the desert pressing against her chest again. It's that same strange pull, as if the land itself was watching her every move. She looked down into the well one last time, expecting only darkness. But this time, she saw something move far below, a flicker of pale light. Faint and shifting, like a lantern swinging in the deep. Her breath caught. She wanted to believe it was a trick of her eyes, but as the light swayed again, she heard it, her name soft and clear, rising from the darkness below. She stepped back, the sound echoing through her mind. The wind picked up, swirling dust around her feet. She clutched the piece of fabric in her hand, unable to let go. Whatever was calling her from that well wasn't done. The ranch wasn't just her inheritance, it was her invitation. And somewhere deep in the earth beneath her grandfather's land, something was waiting to be found. The pale light from the well haunted her through the day. She tried to busy herself with chores that made sense in a desert ranch life. She swept the porch, patched a torn screen, stacked the split wood that had sat untouched for seasons. Work steadied her hands, but not her thoughts. The windmill turned slow, clicking like a clock with a broken tooth. And each click felt like a reminder that time on this land moved differently. She kept the locket in her pocket, the scrap of blue cloth tucked inside the journal. Every step she took, it felt like the ranch watched and weighed her. Deciding if she belonged, the rider returned near sundown, coming up the slope without hurry. He dismounted and stood with the easy stillness of a man who listens deeper than most. He asked if she had slept. She told him about the light, the voice that knew her name. He did not flinch. He said folks in town once told stories about a woman who waited on this ground through more than one season, a woman tied to a promise no one could keep. He said the stories shifted depending on who told them. In one, the woman lost a child to the well. In another, she sent the child away to save it from a fever, and the child never returned. Either way, the well kept its place in each version. Like a witness that never spoke plain, he asked to see the markings on the stones. Together they walked out across the sand. He studied the carvings with a slow patience. He said some looked like cattle brands strung together, others like river symbols from old maps. He pointed to one that looked like a coil and said miners used to scratch that shape near a vent to mark fresh air. He said there was talk long ago of a shallow seam running under the ridge behind the windmill. Her grandfather never worked it. Some neighbors tried, then quit when a storm flooded their cut and 2 men did not come out. He said the ridge never settled right after that. The rider let his fingers rest on the stone a moment, and then drew back as if it had stung him. She told him about the torn pages and the unsent letter. He leaned on the well curb and said if the old man had meant for her to turn away, he would have sold the place. He said leaving ground like this to blood usually means there is something worth more than money buried in it. Then he asked a question she had been avoiding. What did she want from this land? Not what she thought she should want. What she truly wanted. She surprised herself by answering. She said she wanted a reason to stay that was stronger than fear. He nodded like he had expected that all along. He said the town kept an old ledger from when the first claims were filed, and if there had been a dispute or a debt or a sworn promise, it might live there in faded ink. He would ride in the morning and see what he could find. That night, the wind came off the ridge with a dry hiss that lifted the dust in thin veils. She lit the lantern and set it near the window. The shadows changed shape across the floorboards as the flame wavered. She was halfway to sleep when she heard a new sound, faint but steady, coming from the barn, a dull tapping. She grabbed the lantern and pushed the door open. The night pressed around her like a weight. The barn stood black against the stars. Inside, the tapping stopped. The air smelled of old straw and iron. The trunk in the corner was no longer buried under dust. Someone had dragged it a foot across the floor. Her throat tightened. She held the lantern low and saw that the padlock had cracked at the hinge, not broken open. Split from rust and pressure, as if time had been pushing on it for years, and chose that night to let go. She lifted the lid with care. Inside lay a folded canvas coat, a coil of rope, a tin box, and a ledger of her own family's making. The coat fell apart as she moved it. The rope turned to dust in her fingers. The tin box, though, had survived. Inside the box was a small brass key, a strip of kid leather, and a sketch drawn in charcoal. The sketch was a map of the ranch set from a high angle, as if seen from the ridge at sunrise. A straight line led from the porch to the well. Another line ran from the well to a small X beyond the windmill, near a stand of mesquite that barely existed now. The leather strip had letters burned into it. They were the same letters from the stone marker behind the cabin. The initials did not match any woman in the family she knew. She took the ledger back to the house and read under the lantern until her eyes burned. It was not her grandfather's hand. It belonged to someone earlier, a man who wrote in blunt entries that read like orders to himself. He logged head counts and fence repairs, but near the middle, the writing tightened. He noted a woman who arrived and did not give her full name. He wrote that the woman carried a child and asked for shelter. He wrote that she offered to buy the cabin for a price too large to be fair. He refused. He wrote that she paid a smaller sum and stayed anyway. He wrote that the child coughed at night and then went quiet for 3 days, and then went quiet forever. Then the entries stopped for a month. When they resumed, the man spoke of night watchers, of hands on the door, of a voice at the well asking for keys, plural. He underlined that word and then scratched it out like he had changed his mind, could not take it back. At dawn, she walked the line the sketch had shown. The light was gentle, and the world felt almost kind. Past the windmill, the ground rose toward the ridge. She found the stand of mesquite, smaller than the drawing, but in the same shape, like time had chewed it down to its bones. At the center of the scrub, the sand had sunk in a shallow oval. She knelt and scraped with her hands until her nails filled with grit. The brass key in her pocket grew warm against her leg in the growing sun. She found wood under the sand, a plank, then another. She cleared the shape of a small hatch, old and gray, pinned by iron that looked ready to crumble. No lock remained, just an iron ring. She slid the brass key under the ring and lifted. The hatch gave with a sob of old nails. A stairway fell away into a breath of cool air and rock. She did not go down. Not then. She closed the hatch and covered it the best she could. Her hands shook as she brushed sand over the seams. She wanted someone else to see it before she tried the steps. She wanted the rider to stand beside her and say she was not wrong. The town lay a half-day's ride east. She walked it on sore feet before noon to ask questions, while the rider searched the courthouse books. The main street looked like a long, slow exhale. A few shops, a feed store, a church, a shuttered hotel that had seen better years. She bought a coil of new rope and a clean canteen. The woman at the counter had gray hair braided in a rope down her back, and her eyes softened when they heard the last name on the ranch papers. The woman said the old man kept to himself, but sometimes sat on the bench outside her store and told her the land still spoke, even when the wind was quiet. The storekeeper warned that not everyone wished the ranch well. A man from the bank had once tried to force a sale, saying unpaid taxes would swallow the deed. The old man paid with coins wrapped in linen that smelled like dirt. The banker left town after his house burned. No one could say how it started. Folks said the banker had been digging out near the ridge without a claim. The storekeeper lifted her chin toward the desert and said some places, "Punish greed." She asked the storekeeper about the initials on the grave and saw a flicker run across the woman's face. The storekeeper said there had been a girl buried quiet, without a church bell when the fever came through. The pastor had a book, but pages had gone missing. She asked if anyone had known the mother. The storekeeper shook her head, and then nodded at once, as if the truth sat both ways. She said some claimed the woman was from a far valley, and others swore she had no home that you could touch with a hand. She said a few still leave a coin at the ranch gate at springtime, in case the woman watches the trail. For luck, or mercy, or remembrance, she met the rider outside the courthouse near dusk. He held a folded paper and a look that mixed caution with a kind of quiet hope. He said the ledger he found mentioned a claim filed for a water right hidden under a land right. He said a single sentence in the margin read, "Second key with her until return." The writer did not say who her was. He pointed to a note about a dispute with a man who later built the bank. The note said the banker wanted the ground for a reason unrelated to cattle. The writer believed an underground run of water cut through the ridge in a way rare for this country. Maybe it fed a spring further down where the sand met the hard pan. If someone tapped that flow, a small ranch could live through hard years. A town banker might prefer to own such a vein before others learned. On the walk back to the ranch, night gathered fast. They spoke little. The air cooled, and the stars came alive. When they reached the yard, the lantern on the porch still burned where she had left it. The flame had burned low, but steady, as if protecting the doorway. They went to the barn, looked at the broken lock, then to the hatch near the mesquite. She showed him the stairs. They stood with their heads bent over the hole like kids peering into a secret. He tested the first step with his boot and said, the supports still held. He lit a small coil of sage from his saddlebag and let it smoke over the opening like a blessing. He said the earth below smelled like limestone and old air, not like a tomb. He asked if she wanted to wait for morning. She said yes. He nodded. The coil burned down and the smoke drifted. For the first time, she felt that the ranch had given them permission to proceed, but also a warning to move with care. They sat on the porch until late, sharing coffee that tasted of tin and heat. He told her of a winter he had spent at the far end of the valley when the storms closed the pass and food ran short. He said that when fear grows larger than the sky, a person looks for a small thing to hold, a nail, a coin, a sentence. He asked what small thing she held now. She said the locket. He asked if she had ever considered that the voice calling her home might not mean comfort. It might mean work. It might mean keeping a promise made by someone else. She did not answer. She could feel the weight of the key in her pocket and the weight of the land in her shoulders, and understood that both were the same in some quiet way. Near midnight, the wind lifted without warning. The air turned sharp, and the world seemed to tense. From the direction of the well came the clear sound of metal striking stone, once, then again. They rose as one and crossed the yard. The wind carried a scent like wet earth, though the sky had not given rain. The well mouth stood black. The rider lowered the lantern, and the light licked across the stones. Somewhere far below, light moved against light, as if a lantern swung in a slow hand. Then the voice rose, gentle and firm, speaking her name in a second word she had never heard before, but somehow understood. It sounded like a request. It sounded like a hand open in the dark. They stepped back from the well at the same time and turned toward the hatch. The rider said they would go down at first light with rope and steadiness and leave. A sign at the porch in case someone came looking. She nodded, but felt the pull of the stairs like a tide. Every grain of sand on the ranch seemed to whisper the same thing. She went inside and laid out the rope, the lantern oil, the canteen, the ledger, the tin box, the leather strip with the burned initials. She placed the locket on top of the map. The blue cloth caught the lantern glow and looked almost new. Before she closed her eyes, she thought of the banker's house that burned, of the girl with a grave marked in initials that were not hers, of coins left at the gate in quiet spring seasons. She thought of the two keys, one in her pocket, the other with her. The words from the margin kept turning in her head. Second key, with her until return. She did not know who her was, or if return meant walking up into daylight or something older and deeper. Outside, the wind eased and the night settled. The ranch breathed, and the well held what it held. At dawn, when the first line of light touched the ridge, she stepped onto the porch and found a single old coin resting on the top stair. It was worn smooth by many hands. No tracks led up to it. No tracks led away. She picked it up and felt the metal warm against her palm. The rider tightened the rope and tested his knot. The windmill clicked its broken clock. Somewhere beneath them, water or memory moved through stone. She looked at the hatch and felt the voice inside her own chest answer the one below. Then, before any plan could harden into safety, a shadow crossed the yard from the far fence and stopped at the edge of the windmill's shade, as if uncertain whether to step into the light. The shadow that crossed the yard stopped just beyond the windmill's broken blades. For a long while, neither she nor the rider moved. The air had that still charged feeling right before a storm, though the sky above was empty. The lantern's flame bent low, trembling in the breeze that carried no scent of rain. The shadow shifted, and in the dim light they saw it was a woman, or something shaped like one. She stood barefoot in the dust, her dress faded to the color of old smoke, hair falling over her face. The rider whispered her name, low and uncertain, but the woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the well and began walking. Each step slow and soundless, as if her feet didn't quite touch the ground. The woman on the porch felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She wanted to call out, to ask who she was, but her voice stuck in her throat. The rider reached for her arm, holding her still. The figure stopped by the well, and for a moment it looked like she was staring down into it. The night grew heavier, the silence thick enough to hear the pulse in her own ears. Then the figure bent, lifted her hand as though reaching toward something in the dark, and faded, not vanished, but melted into the wind like smoke into air. When it was over, the desert seemed to breathe again. The windmill creaked once, then stilled. The rider said nothing for a while. He just looked at the well, then at her, and said, "It's not the first time." His voice was calm, but his hand trembled when he reached for his flask. He said there had been talk among the old ranchers years ago, stories of a woman who walked when the moon was high, calling the name of whoever owned the land. No one ever answered her twice. The first time she called, it was a warning. The second time, it was a promise. And the third, it was a trade. They sat in the silence until the lantern burned low. The rider said they'd go down the hatch at sunrise, no later. If there was a reason for the light, the voices, the footprints, they'd find it. She nodded, but the words barely reached her. When she looked toward the horizon, she could still see the faint shimmer where the figure had stood, like heat rising from the earth. By dawn, the world had gone pale again. The desert looked harmless under the sun, gentle, endless, asleep. But when she looked at the hatch, it didn't feel like a place for daylight. The rider tied the rope to the windmill's base, tested the knot, and handed her one end. He said if anything happened, she was to pull twice. He'd climb down first. The first few feet swallowed him quickly, his voice echoing up the stone like words in a church. Then it was quiet. She waited, counting each breath, until his lantern glow disappeared completely. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then she heard his voice again, faint and rough, calling for her to come down slowly. The air grew cooler with each step she took. The stones were damp, worn smooth by time. The deeper she went, the more she smelled something faintly sweet, not decay, or old earth mixed with iron. Her boots touched solid ground at last. The space opened into a narrow tunnel carved from rock, the ceiling low enough that they had to stoop. The walls glistened as if with moisture, though the desert above hadn't seen rain in months. The rider held his lantern high, and the light caught something embedded in the stone, metal veins, thin as roots, running in branching lines. She reached out and touched one. It was cold, and it hummed softly under her fingertips. They followed the tunnel until it widened into a chamber. There was a wooden table in the center, long rotted but still holding its shape. On it lay another lantern, unlit, and beside it a book covered in dust. The rider brushed it clean and flipped it open. The first page was blank. The next held her grandfather's handwriting. It was dated just weeks before his death. "I hear her again," he had written. "The woman with the child. She says the debt was never paid." I told her I don't know what she means. She said, "It was buried with the second key. I dream of water every night, but when I wake, the land is dry." Her hands shook as she turned the pages. The later entries grew frantic, his handwriting wild and uneven. He wrote of lights in the well, of footsteps on the stairs, of a whisper saying his name when no one else was home. The last page had only one sentence: "When she calls my blood, she'll find it ready." The ink had bled through the paper. As if written with shaking hands, they looked at each other, the weight of the silence pressing close. The writer said they should leave, but she shook her head. Something inside her refused. She followed the faint hum through the chamber to a small wooden door at the far end, nearly hidden behind a fallen beam. It opened with a groan, revealing another passage, narrower, darker. She raised her lantern and saw what looked like a small pool at the end, glowing faintly blue. The water shimmered with its own light, clear and still, reflecting the ceiling like glass. She knelt beside it, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. Her reflection rippled across the surface, but it wasn't only hers. Another face appeared beside it. The woman from the photograph, pale and solemn, her eyes filled with sorrow. The same soft voice from the well spoke again, so close it felt like it came from within her. "You found the key," it said. "Now open what he closed." The writer stepped forward, his lantern shaking. He said not to answer, not to speak to it, but it was too late. The pool began to move, circles spreading outward, as if stirred by a hidden current. She saw shapes in the water, the ranch, the windmill, the well, and then something else, something buried beneath them. Wooden beams, ropes, a figure chained to the stone. The air grew colder, her breath visible. The writer grabbed her shoulder and pulled her back, but the pool didn't calm. It pulsed brighter until the entire chamber flickered in its glow. From somewhere deeper underground came a low, grinding sound like a door opening after centuries. Dust fell from the ceiling. The tunnel behind them began to groan, as if the earth itself was shifting. The writer shouted for her to run. They stumbled back toward the rope, lanterns swinging, shadows dancing across the walls. The hum in the stone turned to a throbbing vibration that rattled their bones. Halfway up the stairs, the air seemed to pull downward, like the earth was inhaling. Her foot slipped, the lantern fell, and darkness swallowed everything. When she woke, the world was silent again. The writer's voice echoed faintly above, calling her name. She answered, but her throat was raw. The rope hung limp beside her, frayed halfway down. The tunnel walls glowed faintly, their light dimming like embers. She crawled back toward the chamber, drawn by the fading sound of water. The pool was gone. In its place was a dry pit, and a single object lying at the center, another brass key, identical to the one she carried. When she picked it up, the ground beneath her trembled. The stone cracked, splitting in a jagged line that ran straight toward the tunnel wall. Behind the wall came the faint echo of footsteps, slow and dragging, like someone walking through shallow water. She ran. Her palms scraped the rock, her breath tearing through her lungs. The rope was gone, pulled up or broken. She couldn't tell. She called out to the rider, and for a moment she thought she heard his voice answering, faint and distorted. But then came another voice, hers. It called from below, calm and steady, asking her to stay. The sound froze her blood. She turned toward the darkness and saw her own silhouette standing at the far end of the tunnel, lantern in hand, smiling faintly. The figure whispered, "It's not done." The light from above broke through just then. The rider reached down, catching her arm, pulling her up with all his strength. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping. The desert was bright, cruel in its stillness. The hatch behind them slammed shut with a force that sent a shudder through the earth. They stared at it, both shaking, unable to speak. The brass key still burned in her palm. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat by the fire outside the cabin, watching the flames twist in the wind. The rider said they needed to leave the ranch. He said the land didn't want them here, but she couldn't. The second key, the vanished water, the voice, none of it felt finished. Every sound in the desert seemed to lean toward her, waiting for her decision. When the wind rose again, she could swear she heard faint laughter carried in it, like soft and distant, like a lullaby from under the earth. The rider looked at her and said, "Whatever you brought back down there, it didn't stay." The windmill creaked once more. The well began to hum again, low and steady. And from deep beneath the sand, something answered the night after the ground shook. The fire burned low and steady, but neither of them moved closer to it. The desert stretched around them in complete silence, the kind that seemed to listen more than it rested. The rider stared at the hatch while she held the brass key between her fingers, feeling its weight, its warmth, and something deeper, a pull, like the heartbeat of the land itself. The hum beneath the ground had stopped for now, but she knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been locked below wasn't gone. It was waiting. At first light, she went back to the cabin. The inside felt different, as if the air had been turned upside down. The walls no longer creaked in their old rhythm, and the faint scent of pine had been replaced by the smell of damp earth. On the table lay the journal she had left by her bed, but it wasn't open to the last page anymore. Someone, or something, had written on a fresh page in the same hand as her grandfather's. The writing was faint. The second key opens the way home. Don't fear her. She remembers the promise I could not keep. She read it over and over until the words began to blur. The writer stepped inside and froze when he saw the message. He asked if she had written it, but one look at her face gave him the answer. He poured water into the tin cup and said, "Your grandfather must have known she'd come back. He knew it would end with you." She didn't respond. Her thoughts were already back at the well, the center of it all. The voice, the woman, the water, the lights. Everything started and ended there. The ranch hadn't just been an inheritance. It was a calling that stretched across generations. She could feel it now, how the land and the blood had been tied together. By midday, the wind had risen again, brushing dust across the open ground. The sky looked heavier, hazed with light like a storm far away. She walked to the well with both keys clutched tight. The rider followed, though he stayed a few paces behind, watching her like a man who knows he can't stop what's coming. The well stood as quiet as ever, the stones warm from the sun. She knelt beside it and laid the keys on the edge. One was bright, newly found. The other dulled with age. They looked like twins separated by time. She lowered one into the darkness, holding the rope steady. The wind caught her hair, tugging it across her face. When the key touched the water, the faint hum returned, not loud, but alive. A vibration that grew stronger until she could feel it in her bones. The rider called her name, warning her to stop, but she shook her head. "If I don't finish this," she said, "it'll never end." She dropped the second key in. The sound that followed was not a roar, but a deep breath, as if the earth itself was exhaling after holding it too long. Light burst from the well, not blinding but soft, the same color as the dawn. The ground trembled gently, not with anger, but release. The air filled with the smell of rain, clean and sharp. She fell to her knees, clutching the edge of the stone as the glow faded slowly back into the deep. When it was over, the silence that followed felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. The rider helped her up, his eyes wide. The sky above had shifted. Clouds had begun to form, thin at first, then thicker, darker. A drop of water fell on her hand. Then another rain, real rain, after so many years. The sand darkened, soaking it in like a gift. The well overflowed slightly, a thin stream running into the earth. The rider laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "You brought it back." But she wasn't sure if it was her doing or something older, something that had just been waiting for someone to remember. They stood in the rain until their clothes clung to their skin. For the first time, the ranch didn't look dead. The air smelled alive again, and the dry cracks in the soil seemed to breathe. The well no longer looked like a tomb. It looked like a promise. The rider turned to her, water dripping from his hat, and said, "Whatever was calling, I think it's done now." She nodded, but deep down she knew better. Some things never truly end. They just settle until they're needed again. That night, they stayed inside the cabin, listening to the rain hit the roof. The sound was steady, almost musical. She opened the journal once more, tracing her grandfather's old words. Beneath the last message, A faint new line had appeared, still damp from the ink. "She's at peace now. Let the land rest." The tears came quietly, not from fear this time, but from understanding. Her grandfather had carried a burden that wasn't his alone. He had guarded something sacred, a bond between the living and the lost. And through his blood, through her, the promise had finally been kept. The next morning, the world looked reborn. The sand had turned to soft mud, and wildflowers peeked from places that hadn't seen green in years. The air felt lighter, the sun gentler. The rider was saddling his horse, preparing to leave. He said the town would want to hear that rain had fallen again in the valley. He said maybe it was time for the land to belong to the living once more. She asked if he'd come back. He smiled faintly. "If the land calls again, maybe," he said. Then he tipped his hat and rode toward the horizon, leaving her standing in the doorway. Watching the dust trail fade into gold, she spent the next few days walking the boundaries of the ranch, learning the rhythm of the place. The well still shimmered at dusk, but the light was calm now, like a heartbeat that had found its peace. She repaired the corral, cleared the barn, and hung the old photograph back on the wall. The woman in the picture no longer seemed haunting, only familiar, a part of the story that had come full circle. When she returned to the small grave behind the house, she noticed something new. The initials carved into the stone were clearer now, as if freshly cut by unseen hands. And beneath them, a new line had appeared in the dust, a simple word etched into the earth. Home. She knelt beside it, running her fingers over the letters until the rain softened them into the soil. She left the locket there, pressing it gently into the ground. "You kept your promise," she whispered. That night, she lit the lantern and sat on the porch, listening to the quiet hum of insects and the whisper of the wind. The land no longer felt heavy. The air carried warmth and peace instead of fear. She thought of her grandfather, of the woman who walked the desert, of the rider who helped her face what lay beneath. She thought of how some stories don't end with victory or tragedy, but with balance. The ranch didn't need saving anymore. It had needed remembering. When the moon rose high, she caught sight of a faint shape near the well. A woman in a blue dress, standing with her head bowed. For a heartbeat, the sight made her chest tighten, but then she realized the figure wasn't calling her. It was watching, peaceful and still. As the wind moved across the yard, the figure lifted its face toward the stars and faded softly into the night, leaving behind only the scent of rain. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the window. The desert glittered under the bright sky, fresh and new. The windmill turned slow, its creak no longer mournful, but steady, like a song finding its rhythm again. She poured herself coffee, stepped outside, and looked at the land that was now hers, not as an heirloom, but as a home. The story of the well, the woman and the keys would fade with time. People in town might say it was just a storm that broke the drought, or luck, or the hand of nature. But she would always know the truth, that the land and the people who love it are tied by something deeper than words, something that asks for faith, even when there's no proof. She smiled, feeling the soft wind brush her cheek. The ranch was alive again, and so was she, as the sun climbed higher. She walked out to the porch and sat in her grandfather's chair. The air carried the faintest echo of a woman's voice, no longer calling for help, but humming a lullaby of peace. The sound faded into the wind as the horizon shimmered gold, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the weight lift from her chest. The past had finally been put to rest, and the desert, once lost and broken, was home once more.